We're learning Perek Beis Halacha Ches. The Rambam begins Avidu Yishanagu Boiko Yisrael. The confession that all of Yisrael uses Avol Anachnu Chatonu, but we have sinned. We'll go down to the Peirush HaMeir. The nusach of the vidui is one thing that we're going to study when you have to stand during vidui. If he again has to say vidui confession on sins that he did in past Yom Kippur. When is the Halacha Eliezer ben Yaakov? The nusach vidui that Klal Yisrael used, the Rambam says, on Yom Kippur is Aval Chotonu, and that we have sinned, and that is the essence of confession. Because the Mishnah cites the source as Yuma 87b, Amar Avamduri. Amduri says, I was standing before Shmuel, and he was sitting, and when he came, the shlit tzibur came to Aval Gatonu, he got up on his feet. So I said, thus we conclude that this is the most important part of confession. Halacha Mishnah adds that it doesn't mean specifically chotonu itself, but chotonu avinu boshanu. We sinned unwillfully, willfully, and brazenly. Like the Rambam says before, at the beginning of the first perek, Ketzad Mizvada, has a person state vidui, he says, I sinned unwillfully, willfully, and rebelliously before you. Near, it would seem that the Rambam writes, Chotonu, we sinned. In the old texts, old prints, there's a question of whether it says kulonu, Chotonu, it would seem that it was written v'chulu. V'chulu means etc. Vov chov vov, and they changed it to kulonu, and that was the text before the Lecha Mishnah. Chotonu kulonu, we all sinned. That's the years of the Abituri Evan. That he adds that the Rambam mentions we sinned only because talking that he doesn't really have a grasp that he has sinned. Still, he has to say, I have sinned. Maybe he did something unwittingly, and he doesn't even know about it. As it says in the Posuk, Ein tzadik ba'oretz, there's no righteous person in the world who can do good and not sin at times. Therefore it says, only chotono, because that's for sure that a person has unwillingly sinned. But somebody knows he sinned. Certainly has to state what he sinned, and that's what it seems in the Gemara. Shmuel said that only anachnu chotonu. Also in the confession of Rav Amnuna Zuta on Yom Kippur, he only mentions unwillful sinning, chet alone, because he didn't feel that he had no recognition that he actually committed any willful sins. The Perek Aleph, there, when he says chotosi avise peshati, he's talking when he knows that he not only did he do it unwittingly, but even willfully and brazenly. Therefore he says, I sinned, chotosi, avisi, I transgressed, peshati, I did so rebelliously, and I did such and such. Now, why do we have to stand at the time of vidui? The Pri Chodesh says when you say chotonu avinu boshanu, you do not have to specifically state every individual sin. And he brings down from the shiur the name of the Mara Ovadia, that only in Yom Kippur is there an obligation, even for the individual who confesses, to stand while the shlit tzibur is confessing. Because everyone has the obligation to confess his sins, and therefore it's a recognition of that fact. But the rest of the year, there's no special mitzvah to confess, and therefore you don't have to stand up. We find actually, what he doesn't notice here, that by Bikurim, when they came to do Bikurim, so they stood up for them to show the respect for the mitzvah. So maybe there's something similar to that. Now, if a person himself already confessed, is because this is the day that one has to confess. And if he won't stand up, people will say that he himself did not confess. For the rest of the year, if somebody's confessing, I don't have to stand up for his confessions. And he ends that one can conclude from the Rambam, why doesn't he say that one has to stand up from Shmuel? When he came to Vidui, that he stood up. The Shulchan Aruch paskins la Halacha that he should confess standing, even if he heard from the shliach tzibur. We'll turn the page, and he himself, the individual, has already confessed. He should stand, because as we learned earlier, it's a question whether you have to say Vidui with the Zos Hashatz or not. So I guess this is part of the question, or perhaps somebody finished davening already. He came to a different minyan. The Ramah adds he should confess again with the shliach tzibur. That the ikar vidui is aval anachnu chatanu. That we have to do anachnu in the plural. So how can you say anachnu if you're standing there alone? And when you're saying the sign of the Amida, you're alone. The Magen Avraham explains that here begins the vidui till after Oshamnu. That this is the beginning of the vidui. That's the beginning, as there's a long continuation. And from the simple understanding of the Talmud, it would seem that you don't need to do more than that and state specifically each and every sin. You should say this nusach, this text, only when he does with the shliach tzibur, right as it's written there in Sif Gimel, that one should not specify sin aloud. Therefore, you say chotanu, which is an all-encompassing statement which doesn't blacken you as being someone who's a sinner. What the Mechaber says, you have to do it standing. The Magen Avraham adds, and you should bend over a little bit like by moedim. And people do this by slach lanu as well. And one should do it. And during Machon Nesher every day. The Pri Megadim is mistabig. Is not clear if he didn't do it, if he's leaning on something, if it's considered that he's not standing, and he'll have to do it again. The nusach avidui, and when we say leaning on something, it means something that you're leaning on, that if you take away the item that you're leaning on, you'll fall over. But if you're just making sure you don't topple over, then it's okay. And the nusach avidui is brought in the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Tshuva. Now, does a person have to do a vidui confession on sins that he already confessed last year on Yom Kippur? So the Rambam says, sins, averis, shezvad aleim Yom Kippurim zeh, that he is going to confess this year, he again repeats and confesses them in the future. Even though he hasn't sinned in the interim. As it says, keep for my transgressions I know, and my sins are in front of me continuously. This is what the Rambam says in Tillim 51. Because the Mishnah cites Yuma, Tono Rabbanon, the Racham learned, Averas, sins that he did last year, you should not do next year. Don't confess them again. And if you did do so, it would seem that you're doing something that's not correct, because it says in Mishli, a simile, like a kelev who has vomited returns the smell of vomit afterwards. So if you can say it again, it's like you're remembering, returning to that what you did yesteryear. But Yaakov says certainly it's praiseworthy to do it again. It says in Tillim, as we just mentioned, which and Rambam quoted, for my sins, my transgressions I know, and my sins are before me continuously. And he as the Mishnah continues, the Halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer Yaakov, because we have a general rule that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov was, when he said something, it was something that was clear in his mind, and it was something he had received from before. Rashi explains kav, meaning he's only mentioned in very limited places, Venoki, but wherever he's mentioned, it's pure, it's clean. And so writes the Agos Maimonides that was the Rambam writes in Sefer HaMitzvahs, and Rabbeinu Simcha writes it as well. When is the Halacha of Eliezer Yaakov? The poskim, those who codify the Halacha, speak at length. When is the Halacha of Eliezer Yaakov? What does it mean? Ayan Malachim questions if this is only when he disagrees with an individual or even when many are against him. Rabbi Chaim Abulafia asks on the Gezer Mishnah, since the Gezer Mishnah himself writes that this klal is only in the Mishnah, but when it's brought in a brisa, the halacha is not like him. And so points out Rabbi Kiva Eger, and this is an ongoing disagreement from the times of Agoin Rabbi Tzalel Mirenishburg. Turn the page. Meisel Aker explains that the words of the Gezer Mishnah, that the general rule that Halacha of Eliezer Yaakov is only in the Mishnah of a brisa, that when there's no proof that the halacha is like him. But here we have proof from the Gemara, because the Gemara goes according to his understanding, and therefore the Rambam codifies the halacha like him. Because the Gemara asks a question on Rabbi Eliezer Yaakov, what does it mean kikelev shov al kegoin? According to him, that you have to repeat it every year. How does he translate Mishli? And he explains Ragavuna, where he did it again. And when a person does it again, at times the person thinks, it's okay, it's not such a big aveira. The Gemara says that's only according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, because according to the Chachamim, it's talking about that he's confessing even though he didn't sin again. And therefore we see that whenever the Gemara goes according to one individual, they are saying so because that's the halacha. And one cannot explain that the questions are Rabbi Yaakov, how will he explain Rav Huna's words? But there the Gemara itself asking the question. And that the Gemara does not explain the posuk Chatozi Negdi Samid. Therefore, according to the Chachamim, why they don't ask the question? Why don't the Chachamim? How do they explain David HaMelech having the sin before him if he doesn't have to confess continuously? There's a proof that the Gemara is opinions with Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The Chacham Tzvi wants to explain why the Rambam passes like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, because the posuk of Chotozi Negdi Somid seems to be clear that you have to do it again and again. Well, how then would do the Chacham explain the posuk? Because the Chacham definitely knew the posuk. So the Medrash Rabbah mentions that it would seem their opinion, this Medrash is according to the Chachamim, because the Medrash calls someone who goes ahead and confesses again the posuk, another posuk, Teolamno Sivsei Sheker, that it should be lost those who speak false. As the Rebbe used to say, years ago, people said the truth and said the falsehoods in shul, and they said the truth outside. And today they say the truth in shul and they say false outside. How do you explain that? When they used to say I sinned and they didn't sin, so they were saying a falsehood in shul. When they went outside, whatever they said was the truth. They were tricking people. And today, when we say later, when we say we have sinned, we have actually sinned. So we're saying the truth in shul. And outside, we're saying falsehoods. The Veiter asks a question, according to this Medrash, how can you understand the posuk of David HaMelech Chotozi Negdi Somid? So the Medrash explains, in the Medrash Shiur HaTov, it's written Chotozi Negdi Somid, that it should be something that I can't continuously regret in my mind and in my heart, but not to mention them. So therefore, we have find the answer of the Chachamim that they understood it not to be mentioned, but we pass on that you do have to repeat it every Yom Kippur. The Rebbe HaMelech asks, why is the Rambam passing Rabbi Eliezer Yankiv? And it's only brought in the Brisa. We just said, and he brings the teretz of the Seder Mishnah that the Ran explains that the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Eliezer because the Gemara goes like him, like the Meister Keach added from his own, deduced from his own thinking. Rabbi Melech pushes it off because the Gemara says one has to clarify or specify his sin. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda and Bava. Rabbi Kiva says one should hide his sins. So how can you repeat it again? How can Moshe Rabbeinu says Chotam Azeh Chotam Gedolah is Kabiyanai. So we've seen that the Gemara goes according to Rabbi Kiva that one should hide the sins. Still, the Rambam Paskins Rabbi Yehuda and Bava that one should specify. Therefore, one should not explain it's because of the stum of the Gemara, because the Rambam seems to choose to have another reason or source, because the regular Gemara would seem to be in dispute with what the Rambam says. The Shlo cites the source to the Rambam, the Halacha Kabbalah Yaakov from the Zohar. But as we mentioned earlier, there's a whole question as to whether the Zohar would agree with the Rambam, or rather the Rambam's statement is found in the Zohar. However, there's a question as to whether the Rambam ever knew the Zohar or not. We'll say next year